All right, so I would say that we can get started. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, dear friends, dear guests, those that are here in the room, but also those that are joining online and also across the Atlantic. It's good to see some faces also in the screen. My name is Ricardo Borges de Castro. I'm an associate director, and I lead the European World program here at the EPC. And I have today's easiest task, which is to welcome you to the EPC and to this conference. And this conference that marks the first anniversary of Russia's brutal war of aggression on Ukraine is organized under the EPC's, Ukraine's European Future program, as well as the US mission to the EU Transatlantic Challenges program. So let me take also this opportunity to thank the US mission for the support, for making this conference possible. So thank you, Elia, Tello, and also to all your colleagues in the mission. Thank you very much for that. We do appreciate the collaboration that we've been having over the years. Since the outbreak of the first phase of this war in 2014, the EPC, and particularly my colleague Amanda Paul, has been at the forefront of policy analysis and research on Ukraine in the EU. First with EPC's Ukraine Forum, and now with the Ukraine's European Future program. And indeed, since now the most recent full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, since the 24th of February, the EPC has published 24 publications on the war and has held 24 events also on the same subject. So we've been very active. We believe that this is the issue that will shape the most immediate future, but also the next decade. That's my firm belief. So we have been very active, and I think we will continue so. And this conference is also a testimony to that. We have also welcomed last year our first EPC KBF research fellow from Ukraine, Svitlana Taran. It's great to have you here. She's from the Kyiv School of Economics, so it's great to have her as a colleague. And indeed, when Russian tanks crossed the borders, Ukrainian borders, on the 24th of February, the EPC took a public stand. And then we said, and I'm going to quote, "The European Policy Center strongly condemns Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Its latest acts of military aggression are horrific, unjustified, and are in gross violation of international law. There is no doubt their attack will lead to immense human suffering and loss of life. It is the people of Ukraine that are now at the forefront of our minds. As they brave death and destruction and violently defend their country against Russian terror, we stand by Ukraine and unequivocally support its right as a sovereign state to determine its future. Our mission and work as an organization are dedicated to upholding and advocating democracy, international cooperation, solidarity, and truth-telling, all things that Mr. Putin or his regime abhors and is trying to undo with this act of war. Make no mistake. What is happening in Ukraine is a direct threat to the global and European security orders put in place 75 years ago. It is a direct threat to the European Union and what it stands for. It is a direct threat to independent liberal democracies everywhere and the values we hold dear: freedom, plurality, equality, respect for the rule of law. The time that we thought an all-out war could never touch Europe again is over. But although the situation is bleak, we must take heart in the renewed resolve of the EU and Transatlantic Alliance to act together and defend those values. Every time we honor our commitments to our partners, our agreements and our ideals, we prove the likes of Putin wrong and demonstrate that the way forward is not by brute power. In the face of relentless obfuscation and blind aggression, the European Policy Center is more committed than ever to championing these ideas." I end quote. The EPC today stands by each of these words. Slava Ukraini. So we have a stellar group of speakers today. We have an excellent program that Amanda and the team has put together. But before I go to them, allow me also again to welcome Elia Tello. She's the acting deputy chief of mission of the US mission to the EU. Welcome, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for welcoming me, and we are just honored to be a part of this event. I want to thank our EPC partners for hosting this conference, For our Swedish colleagues, for all of their tireless work during their presidency. Ambassador, thank you for joining us today as well. A year ago, President Putin started his unprovoked and brutal war against the people of Ukraine and against their sovereignty. Tomorrow will mark 365 days since Ukrainians have been courageously fighting for their democracy, for their sovereign territory, and for the promise of Europe. 365 days that Ukrainians have been fighting to save their democracy from Putin's illegal invasion. Many thousands have been killed, including children, and millions have fled their homes to seeking refuge across EU member states. Every day, the Ukrainian people remind us that democracy is worth fighting for. Every day, we see their resolve, and it compels us to action. This war, the largest in Europe since World War II, has shown that the European Union and the global community can rise to the challenge and come together to deliver a unified response to this conflict. During these challenging times, sanctions and export controls have been some of our most effective tools at responding to Russian aggression. US and EU sanctions are the toughest ever imposed against an aggressor, and every day they work to bring Russia's invasion to an end. As a result of sanctions and export controls, Moscow has less money to spend and continues to choose war over funding education, healthcare, and investment in its people. From the outset, our response to Russia has been rooted in multilateralism. More than 30 nations representing 50% of the global economy came together within weeks of the further invasion of Ukraine. We have been in lockstep with the G7 and with the EU at every point along the way. This multilateral approach is what has enabled us to successfully immobilize the majority of Russia's sovereign wealth and central bank assets. It is what has made export controls on defense inputs so potent. We will continue to provide Ukraine the assistance they need to defend their country, building on the tens of billions in economic aid and comprehensive security assistance we have already provided. Looking ahead, our task, to paraphrase one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, is to fulfill the mission for which so many Ukrainians gave their last full measure of devotion. And with the help of the international community, Ukraine will have a new birth of freedom, and their struggle will not have been in vain. Thank you.
Here. Thank you, Elia, again for those words and again for the collaboration that we have had over the years. Let me now welcome the Ambassador Chentsov, the head of mission of Ukraine to the EU, to make his opening remarks. Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank EPC and good friends for supporting Ukraine intellectually, not only during this terrible year of war, but for many, many years. I also wanted to thank our friends and colleagues from the US mission to the EU Swedish presidency. We've been fighting all those terrible 12 months together, and we really appreciate as diplomats, as people, your everyday attention to Ukraine, everyday action for Ukraine. Where we are after this 1 year of full-fledged Russian aggression against Ukraine and already 9th year of Russian war against Ukraine. Ukraine managed to survive, and not only to survive, but to build up its army, to build up resilience of the whole society, of the government on all levels, central, regional government. We managed not only to survive as an economy, but even to boost our trade to the EU. For the main reason that we had to shift the trade from other regions to the EU, but still the figures show that now about 60% falls of Ukrainian trade falls on the EU. So it shows how important this partnership with the European Union is during this war, and it shows that all this work we have done during previous years to negotiate and to agree and to sign association agreement, which was a challenge, as you all remember, back in 2013, was really important and necessary to survive this war. Because without this agreement, without strong legal base, strong relations, very diversified, it would not be possible to adjust and to help Ukrainian businesses, Ukrainian people to continue to live on. And this war is very special because if you compare to other regions, to other conflicts, when the life, normal life in the country stops, in Ukraine is different. So our businesses, they continue, and even during after terrible attacks, people just repair, they reopen their shops, their restaurants, their smaller and bigger businesses, and they continue. And this is a feature of modern Ukraine, that we, every time we stand up and fight, and this is something which is going to stop Russian aggression, because they're getting desperate. They understand that no weapon can defeat Ukraine. They try different ways. They try missiles. They try threats. They use new and old tactics, mainly old, throwing more and more people resources on the front. But Ukraine stand firm. I'm sure that excellent panelists during today's 2 hours of in-depth discussion on the situation of Ukraine will be able to present a comprehensive view on each and every topic of the discussion. But I will allow myself to make a brief overview of the state of play. I already mentioned how important our trade, political and trade relations with EU are. But just to remind you that European Union lifted all trade barriers with Ukraine, and today this temporary trade regime was prolonged. Just 2 days ago, EU formally stopped the anti-dumping investigation against Ukraine. Now we are working on the prolongation of the road traffic agreement, which would make sure that Ukrainian lorries go without interruption through the EU. Through the EU territory. We joined a common transit procedure. It's still work in progress, I mean, in terms of implementation, but it will make sure that the passage of our goods through the borders will be more and more facilitated. The solidarity lanes, the experience which EU acquired during COVID times, was used to facilitate traffic of Ukrainian goods when the ports on the south of Ukraine were blocked. And more than half of our agricultural trade goes through land corridors due to those solutions. This is about supporting Ukrainian trade and economy. Ukrainian army is capable and strong, but it would have been much more difficult to push the Russians out of our territory if it's not for the EU military support. And for today, already more than 3 billion euro have been allocated for Ukraine, and next tranche is now under consideration. I'm talking about the European Peace Facility. The new instrument unique one to support production of ammunition is now under consideration. It's an Estonian proposal to mobilize about 4 billion euro to produce 1 million rounds of 155 caliber shells. This is very targeted and very concrete proposal, and we hope that in the beginning of March it will be endorsed by the ministers of defense and then by EU Council. EU military training mission. It was organized during 2 months. It's in a lightning speed according to the EU standards, and in general, EU is taking decision in an unimaginable speed. But I want to emphasize that this is a very targeted and very needed support for Ukraine, and mainly the people, soldiers without any experience, they go through this training, and it's very essential. It helps to save their lives. It helps to prepare them to fight with the aggressor. Sanctions. Today, hopefully, the 10th package will be adopted. Definitely, we would like to see more in this package, and we hope that those ideas about sanctioning Rosatom or banning the trade with Russian diamonds or listing those responsible for abduction of Ukrainian kids will be reflected in the EU legislation. But still, if you look at the current draft under consideration, it's quite solid. It covers quite a significant sector of double-use products, electronics, which is used by the Russian military and defense sector, and is critically important, taking into account Russian drone and missile attacks. So we need to cut them from supplies. It will hit not only Russian but also Iranian defense sector. We need to make sure that Iran think very carefully before supplying Russia with more ammunition and weaponry, in particular ballistic missiles. Also, it's important that Russian propagandists are covered. New names you will see and new entities in this package. Important because Russia is using propaganda as a weapon against Ukraine. But as I said, those issues which are not included in this package shall be considered in the next one. So as soon as the 10th package is adopted, we have to start working on the next one. Responsibility of Russian leadership, of Russian military. This is something which is under consideration of both EU and national authorities, and I'm happy that finally we have a substantial discussion on the model of prosecution for the crime of aggression. So for Ukraine, priority is a special tribunal. We think that it will be the most solid and credible instrument. But we are ready for discussion. We are ready to hear the opinions and to find the best model. It's good that the International Center for Cooperation of Prosecutorial Authorities will become functional very soon in The Hague. It will be attached to the Eurojust, which is a part of the joint investigation team. And this is an important step because whatever the prosecution instrument will be chosen, we need to collect facts, we need to put together the evidence and to prepare the base. Same goes for the evaluation of our losses because of Russian aggression and creation of the instruments of compensation. Most important, to find a way to confiscate the frozen assets. Now the discussion is concentrated around two main areas, two main sources: the private assets, the money of so-called oligarchs, private persons, but also state-owned resources, central bank and other assets. While there is a serious progress on the first issue and EU is finalizing, I mean, both the Council and the Parliament, they're working hard on the new legislation to criminalize circumvention of assets. And coming back to the 10th package, we will see interesting things, I hope. The obligation of the member states to register the frozen funds. So we will operate now with quite a concrete and proof amounts, not general figures, 300, 400 billion. So it's a step in the right direction. So we need to be concrete, both with Ukrainian losses and with the Russian assets we need to use in the future, and I hope in the nearest future, to compensate those losses. So we are getting closer to concrete, practical solutions in all those domains. And once again, EU is changing. Not only Ukraine is changing. EU is changing in terms of the decision-making, let's say at least speed. We will come to eventually to dramatic changes in the future, also because of the Ukrainian membership in the EU. But this is a different story. I'm sure that a lot of attention will be paid to this issue today. But just a few words that we're working hard on implementation of 7 steps. So we do not speculate about time frame. It's important for us to finalize what is those reforms on the agenda. It's not easy, especially when we are talking about the reform of law enforcement agencies. Then the country is in war and you need to concentrate your attention and forces also on prosecution of crimes, on fight with corruption. So it's very difficult to reform the sector, but still we are doing so. The political will is there. There is a very concrete and very detailed plans of implementation of the relevant steps, be it justice reform or completion of reform or institutional build-up of our anti-corruption agencies or media law or minority issues. So we are serious because we know that we need to finalize those reforms in consultations with our friends, colleagues, and stakeholders from the civil society. So the goal is to get there as soon as possible, to receive positive assessment by the European Commission this spring, and to pave the way to the next steps, which is decision by the Council to open negotiations. We hope that it will take place this year, and we will be able to start a new page in our relations with the EU. We will definitely coordinate this reform path also on the way of in the course of our negotiations with the EU on membership with the reconstruction, because those two tracks they're interlinked, in reconstruction in a broader sense, rebuilding what was ruined, but also building new systems when we are talking about our economy, reinforcing our institutions, civil society, and to build new European Ukraine when the war is on. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you very fruitful discussion today.
Thank you, Ambassador Chentsov, for your words, for embodying also the resistance and the resilience of the Ukrainian people, but also for bringing a message of hope that you will continue determined to do what you have to do in your journey to the European Union. So thank you for being with us and for your remarks. Let me now, because there's an other side also to consider in this conversation, let me now welcome Ambassador Lindvall. He is the Swedish ambassador to the EU Political and Security Committee, and you have the presidency of the Council of the EU. So Ambassador, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thanks to EPC and the US mission for arranging this really useful discussion on a very sad occasion, since it's the 1-year anniversary of a senseless, horrible, and very violent war. And thanks also, Ambassador Chentsov. You said the other side. Actually, I'll be repeating a lot of what Ambassador Chentsov said, and I'll try to do that fairly quickly so it doesn't become too tedious. I suppose many of you know much about the EU processes, others know much less. So it's a bit of a diverse audience, I would imagine, to speak to. But I'll say a few words about what we're trying to do as the Swedish presidency of the European Union. Number one, it was clear to us, of course, even though you plan these presidencies years in advance and you have, your priorities and so on, ours were very much focused around competitiveness, a competitive Europe, open markets, put free trade back on the agenda, many things around that, but also a very broad agenda. Of course, we began to realize almost a year ago that we had to rethink. And obviously, just like our French and Czech partners before us, we have totally refocused our attention on trying to do whatever we can to support Ukraine and to continue to put pressure and raise pressure on Russia. So that's really been the number one priority of our presidency from the start. And linked with that, of course, is the fairly or the very important task of maintaining EU unity around this agenda, which requires a lot of work. So the strong support for Ukraine is very much still there. You can see that also in the polls around European member states and so on. But it takes work here in Brussels as well. And nowhere is that more apparent than on the sanctions discussion, because many of the restrictive measures imposed on Russia also impose costs on ourselves. And in variable degrees for various member states. And we need to work with member states to make sure that our sanctions packages are as robust as possible, put as much pressure on Russia as possible. And then you will have the discussions member state by member state on, how do we try to ensure that the cost on European Union member states is minimized. Now, many of us are very much prepared to take those costs. It's important because Ukraine is obviously suffering 100 times more at the very least. But and as you said, Ambassador, it's ongoing. It's today. Discussions start now at 3 o'clock. We hope to have the 10-second sanctions package tied together by the end of the evening. We cannot be sure, but we have good hopes. And we have, as we have always had to work through some exemptions along the way. We try to fight as the presidency to have as few of those as possible. And then whatever is taken out of the packages to get consensus, we try and put back in again in the next package, number 11. This has to continue, and it has to continue to make a difference. So that's one very important portion. You mentioned also the military support. We have this facility, the European Peace Facility. What it does is that it reimburses member states So while we as a collective have provided, we think, because nobody can be entirely sure, around 12 billion euros of military support in total, we then also have a mechanism whereby we can reimburse member states. And so far we've done that for the tune of about 3.6 billion euros. This continues. We keep adding funding to that fund to try to spread the costs across all member states, to try to increase solidarity amongst member states. And for those who are more nervous about giving military support themselves, they feel like they're part of a collective. And you've all read and heard about the work on, coalitions to donate tanks, coalitions for this and that, to try to do this in a joined-up fashion in various forms of coalitions. The EPF has been important as a bit of a roof and a mechanism to facilitate joint action and to ensure that we all contribute to providing Ukraine with military equipment, including, of course, lethal equipment. As was mentioned, what's being discussed at the moment is how are we going to be able to incentivize member states to dig even deeper into their own stockpiles when it comes to artillery ammunition? How can we incentivize that through reimbursement from the same facility? And then the next step, of course, equally important, how can we speed up procurement? And it comes down to very mundane things, as those companies in Europe that produce 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, they have to employ more people, and they have to put in place night shifts, and they have to work over weekends, and it's not so easy. I mean, you would think that it's easy to just employ people, but for one single company, it's not always that easy to find 700, 800, 900 people within a short space of time to be able to ramp up production. We're looking at ways to trying to do this jointly, also to keep costs down, either by using the European Defense Agency or individual member states as procurers for the collective. Again, because we know that we're talking weeks, possibly months, but we cannot delay that any further. So that's ongoing, and something which we as the Swedish presidency are also trying to help facilitate. The accountability aspect was mentioned, really important. We have been working with our Ukrainian partners from the start in collection of forensic evidence and so on. And the EU assistance mission, a civilian mission on the ground since many years, is also involved in this together with the Ukrainian partners, and not least the Ukrainian I'm trying to think of the right office. Prosecutor-General. Yes, that's the nucleus that we're working around. And then Ambassador Chentsov mentioned the ambitions also working towards some form of tribunal, starting with this interim prosecution authority based in the Hague. We're handling that within a particular working group that the presidency chairs to try to make sure that all member states are on the same page. Likewise, on the frozen assets, even more complicated with the frozen assets, very, very wide-ranging legal implications, depending upon if you're looking at the private assets, the oligarch assets, the state assets, and so on. Much more difficult than I could ever have imagined. But that's also being handled in a separate track on our side. The training mission that is now based in Poland and in Germany, with our target is to train 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers. It's going fairly well. We have never ramped up a training mission with this speed. Of course, it builds upon existing headquarters in these two countries, which makes it easier. But still, we now have 24 member states involved with various training modules. Some of them are more general in nature, and some of them are very weapons specific. Some of them are just under the umbrella of this mission and being carried out in various countries around Europe, but most are being concentrated in these two locations. So that's important, and there is strong collaboration with other countries who also support Ukraine with training, including the US and Canada, and not least the UK and its Interflex mission that was even earlier in getting off the ground. I'll mention also all the various forms of assistance very quickly. so the financial assistance, there's the macro financial assistance, there is the various ways of trying to support with rehabilitation of civilian infrastructure, not least on the electricity side, as you know, both with in-kind contributions and also funds. Humanitarian assistance, and also on the food sector side, Ambassador Chentsov mentioned the solidarity lanes and also the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I think now we have to have a very serious discussion about how to make sure that Ukrainian farmers have the confidence to plant, because so that they can be sure that they'll be able to sell their grains. It's unusual, I think, for some of us to understand that in the middle of war, these aspects are also really, really important to think about. So the role of WFP in collaboration with Ukrainian farmers, the Ukrainian farmers collectives and the Ministry of Agriculture, and also us as donors to agencies such as WFP is really important to keep that going and to try to make sure that the agreement with Russia facilitated by Turkey continues and is properly implemented. As you know, Russia is not inspecting ships or allowing inspection of ships at the rate in which they had promised. So there is a huge backlog there. Finally, because I have to hand over to the most interesting part of the discussion, of course, we have the vote today in the General Assembly. So lobbying is ongoing. This is linked to the peace formula put forward by Ukraine that we think is really important to rally support around. And I think we're working closely with Ukraine, both in lobbying for the resolution itself, but also when it comes to putting meat on the actual peace formula itself and looking at the various tracks in which individual member states can be helpful. So in a nutshell, that's, I think, covers most of what we as the Swedish mission are trying to push within the European Union. On some tracks, we have a bigger role to play. On others, the EU institutions have a much, much bigger role to play, the Commission and the European External Action Service. But I think we're all trying to do this together, together with our Ukrainian partners and together with like-minded partners such as the US and UK, but also very much further away. I'll stop there and just say that we intend to, of course, continue with this support for as long as it takes. You know, that's what we keep saying, and that's what we mean. And I'll hand over to you and then the panel, and thanks for having me.
There we go. Thank you, Ambassador Lindvall, for your remarks. And also, I mean, so many of the things that you spoke, and I think Ambassador Chentsov as well, I think a year ago, it would have been unthinkable. So a lot has happened over the past year. And I think to discuss what has happened over the past year, not only what has already been done, but what needs to continue to be done. And I think both of you gave us a little bit of what sort of the list of things that really need to happen to continue supporting Ukraine. I'm going to hand over to my dear colleague Amanda Paul. I think we are we are on time. I think given that we started a little bit after the hour, I think we are relatively on time. So I'll give you the floor for us to have really a good discussion on these things that need to be done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ricardo. And from my side, welcome everybody here today, both group and online. Welcome to this first panel. As Ricardo mentioned, 24th February, the second phase of Russia's war against Ukraine. I think it's also worth mentioning that actually a few days beyond this date, the 27th of February, it's the date when the so-called little green men started to arrive in Crimea 9 years ago. And this led to the annexation and then Russia's manufactured war in eastern Ukraine. Now, back then, I think it's fair to say the response from the West was extremely weak, to say the least. This time, of course, it has been very different, and that is what we are going to be looking at today. This first panel is going to assess the situation on the battlefield. It's going to evaluate the West's response, but also look what needs to be done more to allow for the quickest defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And I'm going to now quickly introduce our panel. We have 2 people online and 2 of us here. Davis, former general in the US Army. He's now also a senior fellow of European SEPA. Welcome to you. I hope you can hear me, General.
I can hear fine, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, Roland Freudenstein, Vice President of GLOBSEC. Welcome to you, Roland. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Maryna Vorotnyuk, Associate Fellow in London. Welcome to you, Maryna. Thanks for joining. You're just here next to me. And last but not least, my colleague, Svitlana, who's the EPC KBF visiting fellow in our. We were also going to be joined by Alexandra Branovsky, but she was unfortunately taken ill today, so she can't be with us. Just before we kick off, just to the audience, the online audience, please can you type your questions in, and I can read them from this iPad, and hopefully it will stay lit up. So please do that. I want to start now, and I want to start with you, General David. Nice to look here. I should look forward. Please, can we start by getting an assessment of the situation on the battlefield? I mean, it seems quite static on the front. So what can we expect in the next few days and weeks?
Okay, I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing your question, but I think I got the substance, which is the situation.
Better now. Can you hear better now?
That's fine, but I've got the question, so I think I can answer it just fine. Concerning the situation on the battlefield, if I were to sum it up right now, I think what we can see is Russia is doing all it can to attack in the east, hold in the south, feint in the north, with the hopes that it will make some type of progress over the coming months. There's indications there might be a reserve of combat forces to allow for another follow-on offensive, but I think their point is they wish to make as much progress, take as much ground back as possible, certainly focused on the Donbass republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, which help justify the reason for their special operation in the beginning. And I think that they want to spoil any possible counteroffensive that may be coming from the Ukraine in their minds. And so I think that what we're seeing is all that they've done to reorganize the chain of command, to streamline it a bit more, put the military back in charge with Grosmov at the top, and the Southern Military District Commander now orchestrating the various combined arms armies underneath him and divisions, as well as trying to incorporate the hundreds of thousands of mobilized new recruits or reservists that they have, is all an attempt to make progress on behalf of Putin's rhetoric. What we see in terms of response is an extremely effective and tenacious defense by the Ukrainian armed forces. And they're doing a great job of employing the forces they have while attriting as much as they possibly can from the Russian forces who are attacking in a quite a disorganized manner, not employing combined arms tactics as we would expect from an army of their type in terms of the types of training we've seen conduct in the past. And Ukrainian, in writ large, I think Ukrainian leadership is focused on building the combat power they need for an eventual counteroffensive. And that will largely depend on their ability to incorporate new weapon systems that have been pledged by Western countries. Think of the tanks, the combat vehicles, additional artillery, air defense, the munitions, et cetera, so they can have the stocks necessary to, and the units well equipped to conduct an effective counteroffensive and retake ground currently occupied Russian forces. So I think that's what we're seeing now, and that's what we can expect. Continued failure on the part of Russia, perhaps some limited setbacks by Ukraine, but then strong attempts to regain important terrain lost, and then prepare, more importantly, for that counteroffensive. When that comes, we'll see.
Thank you, General. Maybe I can have a follow-on question on the subject of, of Russia's strategy. Russia's had, it's performed so far, say not how they were expecting to perform, and despite the mass mobilization that's taken place, 300,000 plus people. Do you think that the Russians actually have the necessary combat power and resources needed to sustain this new offensive operations in Ukraine?
Okay, so first and foremost, we're really talking about a revised strategy. That we all recognize that the original strategy to induce a regime change, take control of Ukraine, prevent it from further integration into the West has failed. It's got just the opposite. It's got a revived and very strong Ukraine, cohesive, with a significant, if not unified, Western support. And so that's behind. The revised strategy is much more about trying to retain as much terrain as possible within Ukraine, ideally aligned with the Russian rhetoric of pro-Russian peoples, Novorussia, historic lands that have been used in various speeches and most recently by Putin. And so their focus is on trying to shore up the east and the south to as much of the 4 oblasts that they've illegally annexed as possible. And there's significant terrain that they don't occupy or control right now. But with respect to the effectiveness of their mobilization, they have squandered the vast majority of their resources by not ensuring that the new recruits, the reservists, are trained and integrated into cadres of officers and non-commissioned officers, which they lack, and equipped units so they can have cohesive units resupplied to the front and then employed in an effective offense. They're not employing them that way. They've sent them immediately to replace soldiers who've been killed or injured, and they've not attempted to train them to the degree they need to be, nor have they equipped them. So they've got logistic problems, they've got training problems, they've had leadership problems, and all that they've done to shore up some of their issues is not going to overcome their poor leadership to begin with, their centralized doctrine and control, their inability to conduct combined arms, alone joint effects with their air and land and sea, all working together for a common aim. So I think their options are limited. They will continue to try to advance, again, to gain ground and try to spoil an effective Ukrainian counteroffensive. They'll continue to focus on their feint to the north to try to hold and fix Ukrainian forces there, and might even attempt to do the same in the south with either maritime forces or forces from Crimea, but their options are limited. And I don't see them being able to even employ whatever additional reserve they have to significant effect. So I think they're going to continue to attrit, continue to flail against the effective Ukrainian defense until there's time for an effective Ukrainian counteroffensive.
One last short question before I move on to Roland. During President Putin's very long, sort of surreal speech the other day, he finished it by talking about pulling out of the New START treaty. What does this actually mean? What does this imply?
Well, the New START is the last, I would say, remaining nuclear arms control accord between Russia and the U.S. So it's significant in that regard. But the statement of suspension, which actually occurred, is more bluster than substance. The New START was extended by a phone call between Biden and Putin early on after Biden was inaugurated within the first 5 days, and then ratified so that it continued on from February 21 to February 2026. So it's significant, but the inspection regime had stopped in 2020. has not restarted because the Russians have not allowed for the on-site inspections that are part of the regime. And they walked away in Geneva last December from talks about starting those inspections back up again. So in all effects, for all effects and purposes, New START has been suspended by, de facto by Russia already. I think it's more of a tactic to frighten Western publics, to ideally induce political leadership to refrain from sending those advanced weapon systems that Russia is most concerned about, or the existing weapon systems. And by advanced, I mean longer range fire systems like the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, its longest range missiles, or fighter jets, etc. I don't think it's going to have the effect that Putin desires.
Okay, great. Thank you, General. I'll come back to you again a bit later. I'd like to, we've heard of the resilience and resistance of Ukraine military, but I'd like you to give us a score of how you see the performance of the EU in terms of its response, its unity, and the challenge of actually staying united, for the next year, perhaps beyond, particularly in the case of a very, very prolonged war of attrition.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Hello, everyone, and Slava Ukraine, I may say. So I think the European Union has, by and large, performed far above the expectations that we all had in February 2022. So I think it's the first time in the history of European integration that the European Union finances via its member states weapons purchases of substantial dimensions for another country. The military training missions, and generally, I would also say that the idea that soft power without hard power ends up being no power at all has really sunk in. That's a positive thing for the European Union. Looking at the way the EU used to pride itself on its even sometimes alleged superiority, at least perceived in Western Europe, the superiority over world powers that only dealt with military strength and so on. So the role of military has really become a major factor and will be here to stay for the European Union. Now, at the same time, I think and this is my second point, NATO is back. NATO is not considered a competitor by the European Union, but actually an indispensable component of transatlantic security. Transatlantic relations are back. And yes, there are pitfalls possibly in future US administrations and so on. But for the moment, it's not NATO that looks brain dead, as President Macron said in 2019. It's the idea of strategic autonomy in the field of defense and security that is brain dead at the moment. And it's no coincidence that the Strategic Compass document that sets out EU thinking on security, has very few mentionings of that term in its defense meaning. And the third element, I would say, where the EU performed beautifully is that now Russia under Putin is recognized as a universal threat. It's a threat not only to its neighboring countries, and particularly Ukraine at the moment, but it's a threat to all of our free societies. And Russia, peace and stability in Europe used to be considered only possible with Russia and in cooperation and dialogue with Russia. That kind of thinking has been rejected by its own proponents of 1, 2, 3, 5 years ago. Peace and security in Europe and our freedom will have to be secured against Putin's Russia. you know, and then of course, then we can discuss about the future and possible regime change and so on. But for the moment, it is absolutely clear that this Russia has to be contained, and that when it comes to Ukraine winning the war, this is in our fundamental interest. So, so on all these fronts, European Union has actually over-fulfilled its the expectations that at least I had a year ago. Amanda, I can't hear you at all.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having a microphone issue here. I just want to stay with the military assistance issue here. This is a big thing in the EU. I mean, we hear this phrase very often, that Ukraine has been given enough military assistance. Is it working? Okay, that Ukraine has been given enough military assistance to hold back Russia, but not actually to win. And as we all know, the decision-making process has been very slow, so has the delivery. There seems to be ongoing concerns about, you know, escalating with Russia, including about this potential nuclear strike, which has become known as the boiling the frog strategy. Now, this recent breakthrough that took place with battle tanks, does that signal a significant change in approach? Are we going to see a much quicker process of delivery? Is Ukraine going to get everything that it wants? To that end, will fighter jets, long-range weapons, and UAVs soon be on the way to the Ukrainian fronts?
Well, that's an excellent question. First of all, what we've seen over the past year, over the past 364 days, really, is that whatever was considered a red line at one point, like, for example, modern Western-made heavy weapons, for example, Western infantry fighting vehicles, for example, main battle tanks, for example, fighter planes. I mean, all these red lines, one after the other, have been crossed. But, you know, and now I'm coming to the German debate. The interesting thing is that sometimes it seems to me the chancellor and the people around him believe that when they cross one red line, they have to draw another one somewhere else, which is why when Scholz finally, much too late, 1 year too late, announced the delivery of modern Leopard 2 main battle tanks, he felt that he had to say, oh, but we're not going to deliver jet planes. So, you know, I mean, on the one hand, that makes me sad because, I mean, you know, when is he really going to open up and say that Ukraine needs all the support? We have these weapons. They are worth much more for our common cause with Ukraine when they're used in the battlefield in Ukraine than standing in a garage somewhere in Wiesbaden or whatever. So, you know, on all these points, I'm a little bit frustrated. Why did it all take so long to get anywhere? And let's be honest, the quantities that we're talking about with the Challenger tanks, even the Abrams, even the Leopard 2, you know, we're all together at the moment for this year, we're only talking about 1 to 2 battalions, right? And that is not going to be a game changer. Now, anyway, these main battle tanks, to just finish up with this point, main battle tanks are not a weapon to be used alone, of course, but this is the so-called combined arms, right? They are an indispensable element together with other kinds of tanks, with infantry fighting vehicles, with infantry, with artillery, and of course also with air power, to be used in combination. And then the counteroffensives that Ukraine is planning will have a very, very large chance of success. But the last word maybe about the nuclear issue. you know, the suspension, the announced suspension of the START treaty by Putin, from his view, makes sense because it triggers a certain fear mechanism in some Western countries, in some Western circles, and of course in some quarters of the German political spectrum, right? Who are just waiting for Putin to say, to utter the word nuclear, and they can already shiver with fear. You know, no matter how decisive or actually non-decisive this single announcement will actually be for the future of security. So I mean, I think there is an element of self-deterrence in the way that many decision makers, and this includes Olaf Scholz, and maybe in some cases even includes Joe Biden, the degree of self-deterrence that we have all shown over the past year is critical, it should be criticized, and I hope it will not be repeated in the year ahead of us. We must become much more self-confident in being absolutely clear that Ukraine needs whatever we can give them, and what we can give them should rather be decided by the necessities on the battlefield and not the question, oh, do we still have enough equipment ourselves? Because the country that now has to defend itself against the Russian invasion is Ukraine and not Germany or France. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Roland. I think that's Skip. You wanted to come up with a comment on this.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me endorse everything that Roland's just said. I think he covered the points extremely well. We have been self-deterred. We've been late, short of need in terms of timeliness and even quantity of numbers. And we've been, so reluctant to cross an imaginary, overestimated Russian red line that would somehow induce some type of a nuclear strike inside Ukraine, or even broaden the war. And so that aside, those, I think, concerns have been abated over time, and we've taken slow, seemingly courageous steps forward to provide these weapon systems. They are absolutely important for Ukraine's continued effective defense and eventual counteroffensive. Now, I spent a lot of time writing and advocating on the tanks and the combat vehicles, fighter jets, etc. Two things there. One, my view in terms of the numbers that are being provided is that Ukraine will be able to first off come with a couple of brigades of additional T-72s from Poland, come up with possibly as many as 3 brigades of Western tanks and combat infantry fighting vehicles to have a fairly important counteroffensive power, but I should force. But the issue is, how long will it take them to build that, to get all of the equipment together, soldiers, maintainers, leaders trained, and then all that information, all that new equipment husbanded securely to the front will take months. And that's why, in my view, we're talking about a counteroffensive very late spring, probably early summer, before they can actually incorporate all this. But they could start earlier if they so desire. But speeding it up will be difficult because of the training times, because of the lead times to bring up the equipment to operational readiness standards, and then that secure movement forward. So we need to be cautious when we expect that all to happen. But I agree, more advanced weapon systems need to be provided now. We need to get over these concerns about the fighter jets. MiGs they can use now for Poland and Slovakia, and they could train on the F-16s that might not be available perhaps for the end of the year. I'll stop there.
Yeah, absolutely right, General, because of course, every day that's wasted, every day that Ukraine is waiting, more lives are being lost. This is not just on the front, but also, civilian lives, because since the beginning of this war, Russia has prioritized killing the civilian population and attacking civilian infrastructure, and this goes on almost every single day across the country. So I would like now to come to you, Maryna. It would be great if you could, give us a picture of how is the morale among your population. I mean, they've lived through 1 year of bloody hell. and it's going on. How are they surviving? How are they feeling? Do they remain, you know, robust and resilient and ready for another year if they have to?
Thanks, Amanda. Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. I see there is going to be a high degree of unanimity on this panel already, because I was going to endorse some of the points that my colleagues already expressed here concerning the Western support in particular. But talking about Ukrainians' morale and resistance, let me say that, you know, year after, I think, and it was mentioned already, that Ukraine's morale and resolve to resist and eventually to win this war remains unshattered. And we've seen a really high degree of resilience and mobilization of the whole Ukrainian society. Russia, we know, wages the total war against Ukraine, and Ukrainians in their turns are engaged or exceptionally mobilized in their total defense efforts at the moment. So I think, I mean, one of the takeaways, because there are many, one of the takeaways of the past year is that it's not an overstatement to say that this is an existential war as perceived in Ukraine, and Ukrainians will resist whatever the cost. And I think this needs to be stressed out because very often in the West, there is the perception that if we supply weapons to Ukraine, we can attach the strings, how those weapons will be used, to what extent, and which weapons to supply. We've talked about the fear of escalation, etc. But the reality is that I think that whatever the amount and scale of Western military support is, Ukrainians would resist. And I think this fact has been often overlooked, that if the Western support diminishes, basically, we are destining those people, Ukrainian society, basically to perish. So, and this is, I think, that it's important to be talking about that. And overwhelming majorities, according to the polls that we've got, they refuse to surrender. They don't want Ukraine to surrender. And they would not accept any peace deal on Russian conditions, on Russian terms, or any peace deal that would, at the price of the territorial losses. This is also important. And we've talked already that the situation on the battleground remains very far from predetermined or decided already. So in general, of course, in general terms, Russia is on the losing side in terms of Ukraine remaining, a viable state, despite the economic hardships and losses, human losses. Ukraine managed to, with the Western support, obviously, but boost its military posture and to consolidate the nation and to become this very important Euro-Atlantic pivot of the Euro-Atlantic security interest in Eastern Europe. At the same time, I think it's important to stress that the longer this war drags on, the war of attrition drags on, Russia might gain another type of victory it rips Ukraine of a better future. It exhausts Ukraine in economics terms, and human losses will continue. And under the scenario of years-long war of attrition or protracted war, with the tension of the West, it's a common fear in Ukraine, with the tension of the West occasionally shifting somewhere else to some other hotspot, whatever can emerge. So this could be a real risk or even threat. And there is a widespread belief that time does not work to Russia's advantage, because of there is this approach that Russia's decline is predetermined under the effect of sanctions. But the opposite is also very true. Time is not Ukraine's ally either. Time doesn't work to Ukraine's advantage either. And without Russia's definitive defeat, Russia still maintains, despite everything, significant disruptive abilities or spoiler abilities against Ukraine. So if Russia is not defeated, this is why supplying Ukraine with all the means that it needs to deliver this defeat to Russia is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Maryna, I totally agree with you on the issue of timing, because President Putin has made it very clear that he's ready to go on as long as it takes, because we're talking about his legacy here. And for the moment, at least for the time being, he seems to have the vast majority of Russians behind him. I mean, okay, they've been brainwashed with disinformation, but that doesn't help us at this moment. But I'd like to ask you about the visit of President Biden, the surprise visit a few days ago. Was that really a surprise? And what was how was that felt in Ukraine? I mean, what did it mean to Ukrainians?
Well, obviously, it was a historic visit. I mean, despite, United States are the top supplier of military assistance to Ukraine, and in addition to already solid military assistance, there was an announcement of additional $500 million military assistance, munitions, howitzers, javelins. So this is very important. But also, it's on the others. Additionally, it's a very important boost of morale for Ukrainian armed forces, but also for society. This is the showcase of support, because the dominant narrative in Ukraine is that Ukrainians acquired high moral grounds resisting to the brutal aggressor, and when Ukraine's allies, United States and the others, they kind of recognize the righteousness of this cause, by visiting Ukraine, by continuing, by boosting so you might imagine this resonates in the society. So this is, a gesture of solidarity that is really direly needed on the battlefields, but in Ukrainian society as well. So yes, very powerful signal, I would say.
Thank you, Maryna. I would now want to move to you, Svitlana, to go into a bit of a conversation about the sanctions, because as we've already heard, these are crucial. I mean, as was mentioned before, Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world, but we haven't seen yet what I would call an economic knockout. I mean, why have these sanctions been less impactful than we originally thought? I saw an article today in the Financial Times saying that many countries are acting as a sort of backdoor to Moscow, including Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkey. I mean, what, for example, could be done to crack down on this trend of circumnavigation of sanctions, among other things?
Thank you very much, Amanda. Good afternoon. So first of all, I would like, as an Ukrainian, I would like to emphasize the importance and appreciation of a remarkable unity and solidarity of EU countries and also other Western partners in sanctioning Russian aggression against Ukraine and in adopting unprecedented number of sanctions. And hopefully this last 10th package will be successfully adopted today. And we appreciate it a lot. But yes, you are right that for now there has not been economic knockout, and Russia still has been able to finance its war against Ukraine. But it doesn't mean that sanctions do not work or are not making pressure on Russian economy. And we can see already first results of these sanctions that will be accumulated in this year and beyond. So what are these results? First of all, Russian economy has been contracting since the second quarter of 2022, and this contraction and recession has accelerated by the end of the year when oil embargo came into force, and energy prices for oil and for gas dropped significantly, leading to significant declines in oil and gas budget revenues of Russia, and consequently Russian budget shifting from big shifting to rather significant budget deficit of 2.3% of GDP in December. So this made Russia to find sources how to finance this budget deficit, and it had to deploy its assets of national wealth fund, and also to increase domestic borrowings and to increase domestic internal taxes. Next important result is that Russia's isolation from advanced Western economies is growing, and we can see this in declining flows of trade and investment between Russia and Western countries. And for example, export of goods from EU countries to Russia in the last year collapsed by more than 40%, which means that Russia's access to high-tech and innovative imports from EU countries has been crucially deteriorated. Next, Russia has lost its premium major energy market in Europe. And just over 1 year, EU countries has managed to significantly reduce its dependence on Russian energy supplies. And Russia's share in the EU import of gas has decreased from 50% at the beginning or before the invasion, which includes pipeline gas import and LNG, to about only 12% at the end of last year, which is a crucial decline of supplies, of Russian supplies of gas. And other EU countries also are taking steps to reduce their dependencies on Russian supplies in other crucial imports, such as metals, such as oil products, such as fertilizers, and so on. I hope that lessons was learned after Russia provoked this unprecedented energy crisis in Europe and weaponized its supplies to European countries. So I hope that European countries will permanently decrease its dependencies on Russian supplies. And but yes, despite all this unprecedented number of sanctions, Russian economy has declined only by about 2 to 3%, and which is much less than was expected earlier. And we could see that Russia, after the initial shock of sanctions, Russian economy has stabilized and was able to survive this shock. And one of the major factors why that helped Russian economy to stabilize was was very huge export revenues. That and first of all, energy revenues that Russia could earn during the last year, even after the invasion, and. According to different estimations, these energy revenues increased by 40% and reached about 345 billion in last year, which is high record revenues. And the total export revenues with non-energy export as well has reached 500 up to $580 billion. these high revenues actually helped Russia to compensate, to offset also private capital outflow of about $250 billion and also frozen access to central bank assets of about $300 billion. And why Russia was able to enjoy and this windfall of export revenues last year? First of all, there are some several factors, but first of all, it's a gradual and partial application of some very important sanctions, which were connected with EU dependencies on major Russia's supplies. And for example, this, first of all, is the most substantial sanction, which covers a big part of Russian export revenues, is oil embargo. And it only entered into force in December last year and February this year. So the major effect of this sanction we could see only by the end, maybe this year and beyond. And about other sanctions as well on Russian exports. For example, metal embargo. It was also first of all, not full, but partial and covering only some of metal products like finished and semi-finished products, but also with a long transition period. So some of these sanctions will come into force in 2 years from now. And of course, this postpone the immediate effect of these sanctions. Yes, so and factors that was favorable for Russia is a high record price on energy resources, like first of all gas. And prices for gas during last year was sometimes 5 times higher, or even up to 10 times higher than the year before, which generates huge revenues for Russia. And also, as you mentioned, that limited number of countries, of sanction coalition countries, and also the redirection of some Russian trade from Western countries to non-sanctioning countries in Asia, like first of all China, India, Turkey, and some other countries, and which is help Russia to secure some trades with not to lose its trade, but this was not like for free. It's with huge discounts and. First of all, it's for crude oil. That the discounts for crude oil reached about $30 per barrel, and which is which is huge discount, and Russia has lost a lot of revenues for this. But I guess that all these factors mitigated the impact of sanctions during last year, but can be addressed this year with new sanction packages and first of all, I think that what can be done is yes. Okay. Very quickly. by increasing the scope of sanctions and by increasing the amount of the current sanctions.
Thank you so much, Svitlana. I'm sorry to cut you there because I know it's a very long and technical topic, but maybe we'll have time to come back a bit later. But I just wanted to stay on the topic of China because you mentioned it, and China. I mean, how China has been, assisting Russia. And I want to put this question to you, Roland, if I may. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about how China is moving from its so-called neutral policy to giving Russia more support. Would you agree with this? And if so, what do you think should be the response to that?
Well, China was never neutral.
It says it was
always,
neutral.
Yeah, let's put it this way. China itself labeled its position as somewhere neutral. I don't know whether they used the word, but they were somehow trying to create the impression, but that was nonsense. China has never criticized the invasion. It's never even used the word. It still talks about the crisis in Ukraine. Give me a break. So I think that says it all about China's basic attitude. Of course, they may have been surprised. They may have been unhappy that the Russians didn't fully inform them beforehand. But in the end, the Chinese know they do not really want Russia to lose this. Now, can they seriously enhance their support, which already is happening with dual-use technology that has civilian and military functions? Can they deliver more clearly military stuff? Well, the US has just been raising the alarm about this. And I think if the US is as forthcoming with evidence as it has been about other aspects of this war in the past year, then I think some kind of collective action vis-a-vis China is warranted. Now, is this going to be a full-blown sanctions policy? Impossible to say at the moment. But China is clearly more deterred than Russia by even the possibility of Western economic sanctions against it, because China needs our markets. I mean, let's face it. And especially in this fragile phase after COVID and so on, when the Chinese economy is weaker than it has ever been in the last 10 years, I think China will think twice if we make it clear enough that we're not going to accept any stepping up of Chinese military support for Russia. So that's my answer to your question.
Okay, thank you, Roland. I see we're nearly at 4 o'clock, but as we started 10 minutes late, I think we can keep going for another 10 minutes. Before I come back to the General and you, Maryna, with a couple of other questions, I'd like to see if we have any questions in the floor, because I had a few on the iPad that were already answered by the colleagues. But if there's any questions in the room, can you please raise your hand? No? Yes? Gentleman at the back. My colleague is coming with a microphone.
Hi, I'm Oliver Kim. I'm a correspondent with the Austrian newspaper Die Presse here. Thanks for the debate. If I have questions on sanctions circumvention, is it rather in this panel or in the other one? Because I'd be interested in these reports we read today by Bloomberg News that there's apparently even off the coast of Greece a happy exchange of oil cargoes between Russian ships or ships that are somehow should supposedly not transport Russian oil to ships that are flagged differently. So apparently there's a massive problem of circumventing the oil embargo. And I'd be interested in your ideas on how to deal with this and how to stop this. Thank you.
I will, okay, yes, I think that oil, oil embargo is like milestone of sanctioned regime, because oil revenues and gas revenues are accounts for about 60% of Russian export revenues and about 45% of Russian budget revenues. So yes, the first focus should be on proper implementation of oil embargo, and I think that the whole economic performance of Russia in this year will depend on how we implement this embargo and how much this embargo will be able to lower Russian revenues for oil and gas. And for this, as an oil embargo also in together with this cap mechanism, and for proper enforcement of this embargo, yeah, it's very important. I would say, first of all, and to make a real difference for cutting export revenues is review and cut price, because now its price cap is only $60, and it's already higher than real market price of Russia, which is now about $45 per barrel. So yeah, it is making some preventive role from possible price surges, manipulated by Russia, but actually it doesn't prevent economic export revenues from doesn't lead to declines of export revenues for Russia. So I think that first of all we need to in March there will be a revision of this price cap, and for example, Kyiv School of Economics is suggesting to decrease this by $40 or even $30 per barrel, and also monitoring and enforcement very important, and just I think that we need to use all the available instruments to make this mechanism work, like secondary sanctions and threat. There is a big instrument which can be used as a threat of by Western countries to disconnect from EU and US financial system, which is very important instrument that can be used for enforcement. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Svitlana. I want to come back to you now, General, with the last question, because I see we only have 5 minutes left. When this war is over, when Ukraine is victorious, hopefully sooner rather than later, there will be security guarantees needed, because one never knows with the Russians. I mean, they can have another go a few years down the line. So what's your thinking on this? I mean, Ukraine have obviously said that they want NATO membership as the first option. There hasn't been any confirmation on that yet. But what would be the alternative in your view?
Okay, let me discard the alternative for a second, talk about NATO membership, and then perhaps, you know, what else could be done. I think first off that there would actually probably be some type of security guarantee provided by a group of nations that have been the foremost in providing support to Ukraine today. Think Poland, UK, US, and perhaps even some of the other Nordic states. I think there'll be a number of allies willing to provide security guarantees. Second, I think the most important thing will be, as part of recovery reconstruction, rebuilding an effective armed forces. Now, they have the leadership, they've got the training mindset, they've got the doctrine, they've got the willpower, and conviction. They've got the technical expertise to have a modern, first-class armed forces. They need time to rebuild. They need the kinds of weapon systems that will provide the deterrence and defense of their territorial waters and airspace. And so there has to be a program to build that kind of armed force. That will be the most important security guarantee. And then in addition, I'd say that NATO membership in the aftermath of the Ukraine victory is inevitable at some point. It will take time to convince all the allies, but I think it would happen.
Thank you, General. And to you, Maryna, I would like to ask you about the EU process. I mean, what are the expectations now from the Ukrainian population? I mean, we all know Ukraine wants to get in as soon as possible. If Ukraine doesn't get the green light at the end of the year from the Council, that it's able to start accession negotiations in 2024, I mean, how will that be perceived or received among the population?
Well, obviously it would be felt as a huge disappointment, because you know how enheartening, you know how important it was when the candidate status was granted. I think it has been really a groundbreaking development here, and also, you know, again for boosting the morale. So, and I believe that this level of relationship already creates another level of affinity between Ukraine and European unity. You know, it's kind of joint commitment to deliver, not to fail. I mean, in all terms, like political, economic, but also in security, because as we've already, you know, discussed and established, that EU managed to become actually a very, you know, serious defense and security actor in this, you know, in helping Ukraine. And if I may just, I understand that we don't have time much, but I was prompted by the colleagues who was discussing about generally EU and Western response, and talking about those self-imposed lines and how it took a year to actually cross from the or to shift from the position we do not supply anything, not to provoke Russia, to where we are now. And yes, it took time, it took preventable human losses, unfortunately. So, and I think that, you know, one might wonder, would have Russian response been different? You know, hadn't those red lines been so openly advertised? What are our boundaries of engagement in Ukraine? I mean, Western, you know, that those boundaries were really openly advertised, what we will not do in Ukraine, that we will not be there, you know, present with the forces, etc. So advertising this as risky steps that West would never take. And the last comment, I think this is really important, is that we often hear the narrative, the statement, we want Ukraine needs to win, Russia needs to lose. We need to deliver strategic defeat to Russia. What does that mean, strategic defeat to Russia? I don't see a unified vision. What is that? I see different readings of this term. And I think that we need to really to take pains to try to come up with the understanding of what this defeat entails. And basically, you know, and the bigger the camp of the countries that understand that no off-ramps or no face saving for Russia should be offered, the bigger this camp is, the better for everyone. So lessons, again, I was talking about takeaways. Another lesson is that we need to, I mean, to kind of understand and to realize that relations with Russia are irreparable, because I see that to many it's still some are still not accepting this as the current reality, hoping for some kind of, you know, Russia, you know, coming, you know, mending the and relations in some. I think that we need to understand that President Putin is a hostage of the war that he started, but he cannot win. So at any cost, they will continue, and that basically to win at any price, you know, and so to understand this predicament that Russia is in is very important for our policy, Western policy making, because in this case, you know, the only scenario for sustainable peace, which we all want to achieve, is not to kind of to reach the half-baked peace negotiations and half-baked peace deal, but actually to deliver this strategic defeat to Russia without off-ramps, without face saving.
Absolutely. And my very last question to you, Roland, it might seem like a strange question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. A few months ago, there was a perception, I would say, that the West was afraid of a Ukrainian victory. Do you think that's the case now? are we all no longer afraid?
Well, let's put it this way. It has become politically much, much more difficult to even hint at this kind of fear. Oh, what happens if Ukraine clearly wins the war and then Russia loses? But if you look at the fine print, the debate about like, you know, what if we get somebody worse than Putin? I mean, hard for me to imagine, but some people are saying that. What if Russia breaks apart as a result of a military defeat and so on? These are like, this is the same debate with different words. And I think, and yet I am encouraged by the fact that it has become more and more difficult to make these claims openly in public. And if you just look at these appeals of some German intellectuals for you know, calling upon Ukraine basically to accept Russian aggression and accept being territorially diminished by Russia in some kind of deal. This has no traction among the people who take political decisions, and only a part of the German public, and I find that very encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should all find it very encouraging. And with that, I need to close this panel. I'm sorry for dragging it out for another 10 minutes, but I think we had a really great discussion on a lot of topics. Probably they all deserved a panel just for themselves. So thanks to all of you for joining us today online and offline. Thank you, General. Thank you, Roland, for joining us from the different parts of the world, to Maryna, and of course to my colleague, Svitlana. I think everybody can enjoy a cup of coffee very quickly and then come back to the second panel, which my colleague Mihai will be moderating, on reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. We're going to move to the second panel of the discussion that will look ahead at Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. My name is Mihai. I'm a policy analyst here at the EPC, working in the Europe and World team, and I'll be moderating this debate. Well, 1 year after the Russian invasion, the fighting is still ongoing. But I think it's important to look to the future, to look at what Ukraine will need. And what we'll need is, of course, a lot of financial help. I think the estimates for reconstruction vary from anywhere between $350 billion to $1 trillion. Of course, the fighting continues, as I mentioned, but now it's a good time to put plans in place and procedures. And of course, here are multiple ideas that are floating. Between grand ideas such as a new Marshall Plan for Ukraine to other different formats regarding the reconstruction. Whichever shape this reconstruction will take, the cost of the failure is potentially very high. And of course, rebuilding Ukraine will be also a very complex process with many core issues such as short and long-term priorities, sources of funding, coordination among donors, and here there is a variety of potential donors ranging from different countries, international organizations, international financial organizations, philanthropic organizations, and sector. Of course, then there is the role of the US, the role of reforms needed for success, ownership, verification mechanisms, and of course other issues such as reintegration of occupied territories, or demining as well, as we're going to hear later in the panel. But to discuss all these issues, we have an excellent group of speakers today with us, and I'm quickly going to introduce them. We have online Tymofiy Mylovanov, president of Kyiv School of Economics. Tymofiy, welcome, and I hope you can hear us. Perfect. Then we have in the room Georg Ziegler, who is an advisor at DG NIR at the European Commission. Then going back online, we have Melinda Haring, who is director of stakeholder relations and social outreach at Superhumans and associate fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Meredith, who is deputy director of programs at the Halo Trust.
Now, a couple of words on the run of show. I'm going to pose a few questions to our speakers. We're going to have a small debate, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience and also from online. If you're joining online, you can pose your question in the Q&A box. I have here a tablet. I'm going to see your question, and I'll read it out loud, and we'll see who's best placed to answer you. Without further ado, I would give the floor to you, Tymofiy. I'm sorry. I understand that you have to leave earlier. So could you let me know how long you'll be able to stay with us before I pose my question?
I will be with you as much as I can. I'll text you. I don't know yet. I apologize, but sure, for quite a while. And then I will be, even if I will be somewhere on the way, I will be available. I'll stop and I will, so I will be online for the duration of the panel. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, and I apologize for, it's been hectic. It's been very hectic with Ukraine, and the anniversary and the war. Yeah.
Thank you, Tymofiy. So I would start with a quick question to you. What are the needs for the overall reconstruction process? And maybe you can also touch a little bit upon what has already been done. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. So there is a thing, the perspective that there will be some, moment in time after which we will do the infrastructure recovery, building recovery, housing recovery. And I think it's a wrong way to think about it, because we often get a question at the Kyiv School of Economics Foundation, why are we trying to rebuild something now? For example, we have been investing in rebuilding a medical clinic in Makariv. Makariv is a village close to Bucha, was not as much on the news, but it's like 10 miles away, was as destroyed. So the clinic there is destroyed and we're building it. And it was very difficult to fundraise for this clinic because people were saying, why should we rebuild now? Russians could attack during the winter, even now, and it will be destroyed again. This is great. This is a fantastic question, but that doesn't mean that people should go on during the war without medical care. And the same is true for housing. I went to this temporary makeshift housing and there's mold everywhere, mold. So people really have, they're gonna suffer, they already suffered enough. So we have to be rebuilding now. Maybe we have to be smart about how we're rebuilding. So we're not rebuilding fundamentally. But maybe after the war we're rebuilding, but it is much more of a continuous process than a discrete one. The immediate needs for rebuilding are assessed by the government of Ukraine at $17 billion. That's what needs to be done now for the housing, for IDPs, for the critical infrastructure, for energy, and so on and so forth. But of course, this number is constantly increasing as Russia continues to have attacks on the civilian infrastructure, on the residential housing, and so on and so forth. Just to understand the extent of damage, the estimates of the degree of destruction of the residential housing in Ukraine is at 7%. So every 12th to 15th house in Ukraine has been destroyed. Of course, it has been destroyed much more, sometimes completely, in the east, south, and north, where there have been active fighting. But also in the areas which have been relatively far from the fire, or completely far, like Lviv. There has been continuous attacks on the infrastructure, on the housing, and people have lost housing. The hospitals have been attacked. Russians have been systemically targeting educational and medical facilities. So that has to be rebuilt now. Okay, so after the war, of course, we are talking at the current assessment by the Kyiv School of Economics. There is a recent new press release, is at $140 billion, 138 plus. That's a direct cost to recover. But if we take the opportunity cost, the build back better idea, the fact that today the buildings code are very difficult, very different, that we need, whenever we're going to rebuild, we will need bomb shelters for one, better medical access, better emergency access. The estimated costs for rebuilding are at, there are different estimates between 250 and 750. You have seen it in Lugano, 750, 350 is the World Bank estimate. That all comes from the same data. It's just different methodologies of prioritization. So where do we get this money from? The answer is there actually on the surface. It's Russian assets. It's the right thing to confiscate the assets and make Russia pay for what it has done. It will be done. The only problem is, of course, that it takes courage, political courage. And there have been some progress in Canada, in the United States. It's very important to get the first cases going almost in squeaky clean so that they cannot be challenged, so that there's no chilling effect after that. But we have to be understanding or aware of the sense of urgency that Ukraine needs money. And, given $5 billion or $3 billion can plug the hole, but it's not even close to what's needed. I think most people in the world don't understand the degree of destruction and how big this war is. It is really big. It's tens of thousands of housing. This is not a public figure. In Mariupol, the official figure that there have been 20 to 30,000 civilians killed and 90% of building destroyed. Of course, Mariupol is under occupation, but when I talk to people who are officials of the record on the background, they say the numbers, and I'm not going to confirm it. I'm just saying this is what people say, and it's probably hearsay. But anyway, I'm going to put this number forward. It's about 70,000 people who have been killed in Mariupol out of 400,000 city. So basically, the Russians, what they do, they set up checkpoints so that people cannot leave, evacuate. They denied evacuation, and they killed people. And it's industrial scale, because to kill 70,000 people in one city, it requires tens of thousands of officers. So Russia has built a machine of destruction, both of human life and civilian infrastructure at the industrial scale. And so I don't think the world understands it. And I don't think the world is talking about it. This is the real problem. And so to support Ukraine and support the future of the world, we have to counteract with industrial support of the economy. The scale has to be much larger. Where do we get this money? Again, from the Russian frozen assets. That's the source which is out there. And it's also fair with respect to the taxpayers of the free world. Why should they be paying for the war while the Russian assets are sitting there frozen on their accounts? So that's the first source of money. The second source of money, of course, is G2G, government support. And the third one is private sector. For the second and the third one, and even for the first one, the governance is critically important. There's a problem with corruption in Ukraine, but there's also a problem with the difference in corruption perception and reality. Ukraine has done a lot over the last 10 years. Since 2013, since we kicked out this Russian proxy president Yanukovych, we actually cleaned up our act quite a bit. We have much more to go. We have to finish the judicial reform. We have to bring the new culture forward. These things have to be addressed heads on. But if that is in place, and it will be in place, I think we can trust that the money will flow in. So the final point I'm going to make is it's important to have prioritization and planning on how rebuilding happens, because we don't want to have it, not well thought through. So I would split it in 2 or 3 areas. The first, immediate needs right now. The second one, quick recovery post-war. And the third one is rebuilding Ukraine and the Ukrainian economy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think you set the scene really well. Actually, you already answered my next question. I think you already looked into the phases of the reconstruction, and also where the money could come from. Of course, the frozen assets, the government funding, as well as the private sector. So maybe I would just, if you allow me, I'll move to Georg now, and then I'll come back to you with a couple of questions. So, Georg, I'm looking at you, and I want to understand better what has the Commission and the EU has done until now? What kind of support has been supplied? To throw in another question is to understand the vision in Brussels on the construction process of Ukraine. And the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much for inviting and following up on what Timothy said. Indeed, we had this big conference in Lugano, we had in Berlin. We had, and what was the big difference? I mean, Paris conference has shown we had to move basically from the big reconstruction, the 750 billion, et cetera, to really what is needed now. That means the developments on the ground, the destruction, the missile attacks, the drone attacks, the destruction of the critical infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector, basically dictated this is needed now. And also something not mentioned yet by Timothy, basically we had from drowning financially, because if Ukraine had gone down, go down actually means inflation, and there's nothing worse in terms of context for reconstruction. So, and there, I think in terms of money, the EU has put the most money. In total, 25.2 billion have been given to you, or are being given. Last year it was 7.2 billion in terms of macro financial assistance. This year it's this big 18 billion package. It was a difficult birth, but it was done. It was done in December. 3 billion have been just paid, January, February, and from now on every month as of March, 1.5 billion. That's the plan. There is some conditionality in terms of policy agreed with Ukrainian government because, and I think that's very much commendable that the Ukrainian government, despite the war, has not forgotten about reforms. Actually, the candidate status has given a lot of incentives for reforms, and they basically want to do both. And we much, also, as a commission being in charge also of the enlargement process, are very much emphasis on to try to do this in parallel, and there is the determination on the Ukrainian side. So in terms of money, this macro financial assistance, these are loans, are very preferential loans. Basically, we also pay the interest rates with grants. So in that sense, they're repayable 25, 35 years when Ukraine, and we are convinced of that, will be a prosperous member state of the European Union. So I think we should not be right now too critical whether it's loans or grants. We just don't have grant money in our MFF. You know, we are not a state as EU that we can just take debt. We now develop this, which is basically lending to borrow, or to borrow to lend. That's what we are doing. But we also used all grant money we have, and we looked really with a loop. Last year we gave, and this was just DG NEAR, where I worked, 1 billion in grants to Ukraine, 686 million in budget support for different purposes, housing for IDPs, also repair of schools, which President von der Leyen announced in the Union message, and for many other purposes, support to small farmers, but also we crafted an emergency package where we helped with various, including cybersecurity and these kind of things. So that was 1 billion. Now President von der Leyen has just announced another 1 billion. There was the meeting of half of the college who went to Kyiv, as you have seen, with the night train, and having 4-hour meeting. And there she announced another 1 billion for this year in grants. Let's say it's not in grants, 50% will be in loans, 50% will be in grants. But we are very much working right now on this package. But this is all emergency response, or let's say fast recovery. It's about what Timothy mentioned. I mean, reconstruction, rehabilitation in the liberated. It's about the destruction, the needs to rebuild after the destruction of the critical infrastructure. Because without doing that, then basically many more people would leave. If there is no heating, there is no electricity, there is no life. Yeah, I think that's what Putin wants, to make Ukraine a place where you cannot really live. And I think here, this is the need of the day to put a lot of money into that. And then the big, I think that was a bit the change, the shift of emphasis from last summer, where we were already planning what to do. We put on the table, or Ukrainian government put on the table, reconstruction plans, and put this huge figure, 705 million. We are far away from this full-fledged reconstruction. I think that will come later. We now need to go after the needs of the day. Of course, we are planning reconstruction. We have now put in place, after the G7 agreement in December, to create a platform of donor coordination. This has now been established. We had the first meeting of the steering board on the 26th of January. The EU is represented there, of course, by the 3 G7 members of the EU, Italy, France, and Germany, but the EU as such is represented by the Director-General of my DG, Gert-Jan Koopman. So this has finally happened. We have the secretariat now hosted by the Commission of the platform. We're working on that. And there will be also an office in Kyiv. And that was planned for a long time, has now finally been implemented. The deputy head of the secretariat will be seconded to Ukraine. So it's we are very much relying on the ownership of Ukraine, and much more money will be needed. We don't have this money right now. There are two options, basically. We will have a review of the multi-financial framework, the MFF, soon in 2024, but we are preparing it right now. And member states have a choice, basically, either to put in more money into the EU budget so that we have, and to increase the headings in the budget that could be used for Ukraine. That's basically one option. The other option is, of course, to allow the Commission to borrow even more, to lend on or to grant on to Ukraine. These are two basic options. We are after this MFA Plus instrument with delivering on the 18 billion, we are now starting to create a new instrument, a tailor-made financial instrument for Ukraine, which covers both the reconstruction and the reforms. So Ukraine would not go from NDC regulation into EPA. Normally, candidate countries are in EPA, but we would create basically something special, tailor-made for Ukraine. Work is starting very soon on that. We hope that this is in place then in the official journal in 1st of January 2024. But the open question is still exactly where to take the money from. So this will require a lot of discussions with member states. Maybe I leave it at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Georg. That was very informative. What I'm left with is, of course, the Ukraine's ownership. That is very important. You also gave us a bit of a figures of what is happening, and also thank you for touching upon the platform for donor coordination, which maybe we'll come back to that. But now I'd like to go to Melinda online, and I want to bring in the US perspective. How the US sees its role in the reconstruction process, and maybe just to add something, how the US sees the role of the EU in this process. And the floor is yours. Thank you, Melinda.
Hi, Mihai. Hi, everyone in Brussels. Wish I could be there with you. And thank you, Amanda, for the great invitation. It's a pleasure to share the stage with these people. And I want to give Tymofiy Mylovanov a huge shout out for the work that he's been doing and that Kyiv School of Economics has been doing. Their reports and assessments are first rate, and I really admire what you guys are doing. I will answer your questions, Mihai. I can answer them in 2 minutes. Are you ready for this? So the attitude in Washington is that we will help Ukraine win the war, and the European Union is responsible for reconstruction. Thank you very much. Get it done. There are some preliminary discussions about reconstruction of Ukraine here in Washington, but they're mostly at the think tank level. I don't see a lot of serious effort on the government side. I don't see a serious appetite as well. They're sort of very intellectual conversations. They're good and interesting. There's a lot of study groups, and we know that this is a complex problem. CSIS just wrote a very good report, and I think maybe we should step back from all the complexities and think about the vision and what is possible. And they have a sentence in their report. They say, we want Ukraine to meet high international standards. I love this. Finnish levels of defense spending and engagement, Japanese level infrastructure, German style manufacturing, an information and communication technology sector modeled on the Baltic states, and an agricultural sector with Canadian levels of productivity and efficiency. I like that they started with something big and visionary. And when you talk to Ukrainians like Tymofiy and others, they'll tell you that there is an opportunity to rethink something as simple as train lines and rail hubs, if we do it right, and that's the big question. So in the United States, as far as I can see, our attitude is we're very, very focused on weapons, and I'm making sure that the war is won. And you guys are a lot closer, and you guys are probably going to be in charge of reconstruction. I know there is, movement within the State Department, and that we're going to set someone up to be the coordinator for assistance, but I think we're probably going to take a lesser role. I wanted to riff off of a few things Tymofiy said, if you don't mind. I do work for a Ukrainian organization. I am an American. I work for the Superhumans Center, and I couldn't agree with Timofey more that no one is going to blow a whistle and say, let's go, let's start the Marshall Plan now. Rebuilding is already happening right now. And you see this with Timofey's efforts. He has something called the Safe Schools Initiative. And Mihai, schools can't reopen in Ukraine if they don't have bomb shelters. And these are crude. They're really, really basic. They have chessboards and cookies and toilets. But if we want Ukraine to succeed, if we want Finnish levels of spending and engagement and Japanese level infrastructure, education has to be at the top of the priority list. At Superhumans, in the middle of the war, it's the ultimate act of faith and defiance. We are building a multi-million-dollar medical center in Lviv. It opens in April, and we're going to provide state-of-the-art prosthetics, reconstructive surgery, PTSD treatment, and rehabilitation. We are working on getting international insurance, and that needs to be, again, in Timofey's very neat categories of immediate needs. We need to make sure that international insurance is available to those who are sticking their necks out right now and trying to rebuild. So that would be very high on my list as well. I agree with my fellow panelists that it's incumbent on the West to meet the needs now. The things that I'm worried about, I have 2 more points and then I'll close. The things that I'm worried about right now, though, are some of the things that have been mentioned, but I'm also worried about demography. We don't know how many Ukrainians there are in Ukraine, and Ukraine has not had a census since 2001. It doesn't make sense to talk about reconstruction without knowing how many Ukrainians they are and where are they and where do they want to live. So I would urge anyone who's talking about reconstruction to know the basic figures before we start talking about these grand plans. I'm worried about education and job retraining. You're not going to get young people to come back, especially mothers with children, without education and without a source of income. Housing, Timothy mentioned it. Demining, my colleague will mention in just a minute. Ukraine is going to become, or is, the most heavily mined country in the world. You can't restart a country with that many mines. And then prosthetics are going to be a big issue. More than 10,000 people need prosthetics and complex surgeries. As we have these discussions, again, I'm an American, and I'm going to say this as loudly as possible. I urge all the old dinosaurs of the international financial institutions to go Ukraine first. Don't use the old, expensive, slow dinosaurs. Ukraine has massively changed. Timofey is totally right. Use the young, vibrant, capable Ukrainian organizations. They know the needs better than we do. They can absorb large amounts of money. They know what it means to be transparent. They're nimble, they're faster. And we also need to deal with the massive unemployment crisis in Ukraine. Many, many people have lost their jobs, and the economy has contracted between 30 and 40%. So I'm going to stop there. The challenge is ahead of us, but it's also a great opportunity if we do it right and we work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. That was great. Message received. Vision is very important, and then the EU should take a leading role in the reconstruction. Maybe I'll just stay with you for a minute, and I'll ask you a question about the role of civil society on the long term in the reconstruction of Ukraine. How do you see this?
So civil society is going to be a huge player. I was in Lugano as well, and I was sitting out in the audience, and I was in a row with the Ukrainian civil society, and they kept elbowing me, and they were angry, and they said, I don't know what this plan is on stage, the $750 billion plan. The government didn't consult us. And anyone who knows anything about Ukraine knows that civil society is strong and vibrant, and it can do things that civil society in my country and your country cannot do. They are a major actor, and you ignore them at your peril. I think the government is getting better at including them in reconstruction decisions. But you know, if you follow the history of Ukraine since 2014, since 2013, civil society is the key actor. You cannot rebuild without their oversight, without their knowledge, without their moxie. So they're going to be intimately involved in this. You know, there's a lot of challenges, and they're going to need our help as well. But I think they're going to be very, very important, you know, in the watchdog role in particular. But to build on one more point, though, that I would put on my worry list, I'm very worried about the media scene in Ukraine in terms of reconstruction, in terms of Ukraine's long-term democracy. So Ukraine is a country where TV is king, and the top 10 TV stations are all owned, are not independent. And one thing that happened in the middle of the war that didn't get enough attention is that Rada TV, which is watches the RADA was pulled, and there's fewer and fewer sources of information. So as Ukraine is awash in donor funds, we're going to need more independent media and more watchdogging on a domestic side to make sure that the money goes to the right places, and that donors get what they want, and that Ukrainians get what they want.
Thank you, Melinda. You touched upon quite a few points. I'm sure we'll come back to a couple of them in the Q&A. But now I'd like to stick to something more specific and to zoom in a little bit on a specific challenge, which is the challenge of landmines. And I'm looking at you, Tom. Maybe you can say a couple of words about the impact of the landmines and the scale of the challenge of demining Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikael. Yeah, absolutely. And I've been thinking about how all of the panelists so far have talked about really important high-level reconstruction efforts. And while demining may seem a little niche to some, actually it touches upon all of these as a huge enabler of what must follow. So I'll try and explain the impact, and I'll try and explain where I think demining in Ukraine needs to go. So my name is Tom Meredith. I'm from the Halo Trust. I have 600 colleagues in Ukraine at the moment, all Ukrainians who are demining at the moment. We plan that number to be at about 1,200 by the end of the year. We've been there since 2016. I contacted some of my colleagues in Kyiv this morning just to get us latest statistics. We keep track of the number of accidents, which is a very crude and tragic metric, but it's an important one just to understand the very direct impact that mines are having. Over the last year, we've recorded 358 separate accidents, resulting in 618 casualties. Sadly, this has resulted in 191 civilian deaths. And if you drill down into these statistics, you start to notice some interesting trends. So nearly half of those accidents have come from anti-vehicle mines, and the majority of those are actually in agricultural areas. So we heard this morning in Ambassador Lindvall's opening remarks about confidence to plant. And that's got particular resonance at a very, very local level to individual farmers who are having to take chances with their own land. We recorded 52 casualties who were doing reconstruction work or repair work at the time. So these are people who are fixing substations, they're repairing water utilities, gas pipelines, etc. So we're already seeing the kind of longer term impact that this has on reconstruction efforts. Perhaps let me just step back out a little bit and talk a little bit about the way that landmines, explosive ordnance, abandoned ammunition, which they all get lumped together crudely under a demining banner. But let me just talk about the way that they do actually have an impact. The first and perhaps most obvious one is the very singular humanitarian threat that they pose to life and limb, often of curious children who are doing nothing other than being curious children. And we've seen those accidents borne out in the statistics that I just gave you. The second one is as a blocker, the mined road, the mined field, the school, the health facility. These are places where the mines might be known about, and they restrict some form of activity or some form of reconstruction taking place. And that is very, very significant with the levels that we're seeing in Ukraine. But it's a little more subtle, and it's the psychological impact of the mines. It's knowing that they're there, very present at the end of the garden, or the outskirts of the village, or on the road to villages, that increases people's perception of fear, increases their genuine fear, and it's a real, very significant barrier to people moving on and rebuilding. So it come as no surprise to you to hear that Ukraine is one of the most contaminated countries in the world in terms of its accident statistics. It is at the top of a league table that no country wants to be on, ahead of Syria, ahead of Afghanistan, even. The Ukrainian government quotes figures of 150,000 square kilometers of contamination. This is almost certainly an over degree in that it's narrow this number down of clearance and millions of euros or dollars, rather than figure of years and tens of millions. If we look at humanitarians, you might say Afghanistan or Southeast Asian countries or African countries such as Angola, we know that this is to do. There is not much. Can I just check if that's audible? Yeah, thank you. So moving on to the solution a little bit then. There often isn't a silver bullet. There's not a magic solution to this issue. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of money to do quite dangerous work in a sustained way over a long period of time. We work very closely with the Ukrainian government, with the State Emergency Service, the MGS, with the MOD. We're currently doing training and equipping of the emergency service. But there's definitely a role for international organizations such as ours working at scale alongside them in a coordinated response. So I would encourage people to think of this as a both and rather than an either or in terms of the international responses. There is room for everyone and there is room for more. We're seeing very, very strong support coming in from our usual government donors for Ukraine, not least the 25 million euros that was committed by Josip Borrell recently for demining in Ukraine, and that is excellent to see. I think the trick will be sustaining that. I mentioned Afghanistan and Syria. These are two countries that I'm responsible for with the Halo Trust, and it's always disturbing to me to see the extent to which these can become yesterday's conflicts. And how quickly the world can move on. Now, obviously, Ukraine is very different politically. Its context is hard to compare to either of these two. But clearly, we must make sure that the conflict in Ukraine and the need for support for long-term reconstruction remains forefront in people's minds, and it does not become one of yesterday's problems. So I've mentioned briefly a little bit about Halo's plan there. We simply need scale. We need greater numbers of people, more machines, and we need long-term multi-year commitments of funding from donors to see this happen. Ukraine is a fantastic place in many ways to make this work. The talented workforce, the technology sector, the availability of agricultural engineers to make the machines work. These things actually make it possible to have significant technological advances in Ukraine that would be impossible elsewhere. So we are starting a research and development global center of excellence in Ukraine to complement the ongoing clearance work. So I think there's an awful lot to do. We are going to be there for decades, that is for certain. But it is something that I think Ukraine can be very, very proud of. Its ability in the sector goes back to the Second World War. And I think there's a very important role today. Some of our other panelists have talked about the importance of starting now. Demining is one of those things that should not wait until the fighting is stopped and then the clearance starts. It can and should happen now, perhaps excluding areas that are being fought over actively. But there is so much good that can come from starting this work, saving lives now and getting communities and families back on their feet. So I'll pause there. Very happy to take any questions, but thank you for the opportunity to contribute this.
Oh, thank you, Tom. That was great. I think you gave a very good overall account of what demining means for the reconstruction of Ukraine. You also touched a little bit about the funding needed in hundreds of millions, right, on the long term, and also where the money could come from. And then you mentioned something very interesting, which was how to keep the attention on this issue. Once maybe we can imagine a future where the fighting stops, and then the attention might just simply slowly disappear. So my question would be, how can we actually keep this attention? How, and maybe how you plan to keep it, for your work?
Thank you. Yeah, if I knew the answer to that, we perhaps wouldn't have so many countries that do take decades, because often demining is the first activity to start and it's the last to leave. It may see a transition from purely humanitarian work through a stabilization phase to development work, but it does take decades. We have to keep reminding people there's no easy solution to this. As diplomatic missions come and go, as foreign policy initiatives come and go, we simply have to keep reminding people. That's partly our jobs to do that. We have close relations with many government and multinational donors, and there is also a role for this international community, I think, to keep the focus on it. Ultimately, the tales I think that are most compelling are the ones that come from Ukraine and Ukrainians themselves. It's the individual stories, and not just the tragic ones. It's the positive ones of what can be done after clearance, and what can be done when communities are getting back on their feet. So I think collectively there's a need and there's a shared responsibility to ensure those stories and the importance of this work does get the attention it needs.
Thank you, Tom. So I take it awareness, raising awareness on this issue a long term is the key. Okay, thank you. Maybe now I would go back to you, Georg, and then I'll open the floor for questions from the audience and also for our online audience. And then, Georg, you mentioned at some point a tailor-made instrument by the EU. Maybe you can develop a little bit more about how this tailor-made instrument would look like, and maybe also make the connection, the link with the pre-accession process, and how this links, of course, all together with the reconstruction.
Oh, indeed, the sense is indeed to link reconstruction and reforms together, to put investment and reforms together. The work is now only starting, so I cannot say too much in detail. But I think the fortunate thing in all the said things is that Ukraine got the candidate status, and that means it's on a very straight path into the EU. And I think that gives us the opportunity to embed the reconstruction process in the pre-accession process. If you look back what happened in the Balkans in the 90s after the war, there was also reconstruction agency created in Thessaloniki, but there was no enlargement perspective. There was no political direction. So it was just like a little bit reconstruction without orientation. And now here we have a very clear orientation. It's very clear we build back better, and building back better means building back green transformation, digital transformation. And that's very much what the Ukrainians want, to put it together into this, that at the end of the reconstruction process, basically there is a very modern European state which is then ready to join the EU and is basically, basically will be one of the most modern member states because it had to go through all of this. It would have been better it didn't have to go through this, but if it has now to go to this, let's get it right and let's link these two processes together. I think this is a bit the challenge, but it's really why also Ukraine very much wanted that we, as Commission, being in charge of the enlargement process, that we also play an important role in reconstruction, that we put this very much together. We are very close working also with the, just coming to Melinda, we're working very close with Americans. We in this new platform, there are now 3 co-chairs, so the United States, EU, and Ukraine. We are together in one boat. But of course, you're right in saying that if militarily they don't win, then also it will be very difficult to reconstruct. So that's, let's say, first things first. Let's win. And let's reconstruct as much as we can already in the liberated areas. Here I'm very much with Timothy, of course. And then, of course, Europe has to take its responsibilities. That's very clear. It's a bit more complex than being a state. That's what I mentioned. So we have to be together, Team Europe, with our member states to pull all resources together. And I think the idea which President Zelensky came up with is a very brilliant idea to also involve cities and regions and do partnerships at any level you can have between chambers of commerce, between cities, between regions, between architects, let's say to have a big mobilization for Ukraine, and not just at the top level, but basically at all levels. And what I hear from Denmark, which took a kind of partnership with Mykolaiv region, that makes it different. That you just don't deal only with Kyiv. That you go down the decentralization reform, which was one of the top reforms in Ukraine, is actually proving also very important for the reconstruction, because there is where the music basically plays. The mayors are the ones in charge of the IDPs, of the, so it's not just a centralized steered process. Of course, you need to steer certain things centrally, but the power is basically in the cities and regions. And here, I think to link up Europe and link up the world with these cities and regions, I think that's something that will be decisive for the success of the reconstruction.
Thank you, Georg. I'm looking at the audience now. If there are any questions for our panelists, please raise your hand. I don't see anything right now, so maybe I'll just continue to the point on funding, and I'll go to the private sector now. And the question would be how to keep how to get the private sector involved, how to ensure them in order to invest money in the recovery effort. And I think you're still with us, Timothy, right? If you can hear me, maybe you want to jump in with a couple of words on the private sector. I'm here.
I'm
yes?
here. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
I'm here. I am on the way somewhere, but thank you very much. So yeah, on the private sector, actually, I'm loving this panel. You know, it's really fantastic because it's bring the key issues from funding to structural to decentralization to mines. For example, you know, without the mining, there'll be no economy. And therefore, if we talk about some private sector coming in, we need to make sure that actually, you know, they can operate and build things. But my sense right now is that there's a lot of willingness in the private sector to invest in Ukraine. I'm in the US this week. I'll be back on Sunday to Ukraine. I've met with several people, you know, like private equity, you know, heavy people who make decisions. They want to help, but they all say the same thing, that we don't want to be taken advantage of. So they're concerned. This perception of corruption and bad governance is really hurting them. They're not even looking for a return. They want to do impact investment. They're okay if it's just, you know, it could even be charity, you know, in equity in some sense. That's how they're thinking. Okay, we're probably not talking billions, but we're talking hundreds of millions with people I've met. But these people are all asking, you know, how do we make sure that the project is meaningful and we don't get some, you know, usual story that it got politicized, it got derailed, it got diverted, someone stole something, this and that, you know. So in that sense, I think it's critically important for Ukraine. And Melinda talked about the education. I think this business education to bring the culture in, the culture of good governance, of good transparency, not only at the government level, because we have been focusing over the last 9 years since the Yanukovych on the government transparency, but we are facing similar issues of, you know, not really quite yet being fully accepting culturally the best practices of the free world or developed economies, even in private sector. So for the international private sector to interact with Ukrainian private sector or municipal governments, we need to bring that culture in. So in my view, the bottlenecks is really people and projects and the governance as opposed to funding, at least at the smaller scale. So that I would like to emphasize that people, education, culture, governance.
Thank you, Timofey. I'm looking at you, Melinda. Do you want to add anything on the private sector?
Sure. I would say courts are the big impediment, and there's good news here, and I don't think this news is getting out. So in spite of the war, Ukraine is making real progress in the fight against corruption. You know, war gets all the oxygen, but there's been some pretty significant progress in the last 2 months. The Ukrainians were courageous enough to report that there was misuse of funds in the Ministry of Defense. You know, this is very, very sensitive. And two people were sacked. We also saw someone in President Zelensky's inner circle sacked. We saw 4 governors sacked. We've seen a series of searches. I think that the administration understands that if it wants Western assistance, if it wants a big IMF package, if it wants the business community to take it seriously, there has to be no toleration for corruption at the highest levels. So I see a real sea change in Kyiv. I see leadership at the highest levels, and I think we need to be doing more to talk about that. But court reform is decentralization reform is very, very important. And I think that we see a lot of new leadership and energy at the local level, and I'm really optimistic about that. And that was one of the most brilliant reforms that the EU put in place after the Euromaidan. But we have to focus on courts if we're serious about rebuilding Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. I think I had a follow-up question actually, which is on oversight, how to ensure oversight on longer term. And I'll go first to you, and then maybe go to Georg for some follow-up comments on this. So please go ahead.
You know, I haven't studied this yet, and this is a really sensitive issue. So I think I'm just going to pass the buck, if that's okay. You know, there's a lot of pressure now for some kind of a special oversight, and I'm not sure Timofey has studied this. So I'm going to pass the buck to Timofey, if that's okay.
I have a view on this on oversight. I think we have to move to specifics, to benchmarking, to audits, to the cost standards, to the quality standards, and make it technical. Because the discussion gets politicized and it gets derailed almost immediately when we're talking about, should civil society, should politicians, should someone be overseen? I have just been overseeing this project at this clinic. It's a post-war environment. The construction is fraught with the existing problems in construction industry around the world or in Ukraine, plus supply chains, plus this and this. Really, what's the most efficient is that we have done 2 audits. It's private money, private company. We're not corrupt. They're not corrupt. They're trying to overcharge us. Really, we're bringing it down 40% only because we have run audits by professional companies. So I think, make it technical. Create benchmarks, create the best standard practices, what's acceptable, and then move from that, and then report to the public whether these things are actually met or not, as opposed to have a discussion about the fancy committee and who has the right to be in this committee. I want professionals, professional auditors to be on that committee, not necessarily politicians. I mean, politicians have to be there, but it's really get it technical. That's my take on this. And on judges, I want to implement that. We do have a problem with judges. It's a cultural problem. So it's not only just that we need to get judges, but we also need to educate judges. So we have to create institutions, law schools. Look at any law school in Ukraine. It's still post-Soviet Union mentality. There are changes, there are exceptions, but those are really exceptions. They're outsiders. So we need to work on that.
Great, thank you, Tymofiy. Georg, you want to add a couple of thoughts on this?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think Melinda mentioned it. It's extremely important which work is being done now on the anti-corruption and judiciary reform. I think a game changer was also here the candidate status, because the leverage basically of the EU on these reforms is actually even bigger. There was a lot of leverage and there was a lot of willingness on the Ukrainian side in the first place. But this leverage has really increased, and we have seen it with the Sapo head, this prosecutor for anti-corruption cases. For many months that has been delayed. There was no willingness actually to accept the person that had been chosen by the selection committee, and only when we put it in our opinion on the membership application as one of the 7 steps, please appoint that guy that had been chosen. Basically, like 2 weeks later, this guy was finally appointed. So I mean, here you could see that makes a difference, and we see it's going on indeed in the High Judicial Council, the High Qualification Committee. All these things now move forward and slowly but surely make the reforms irreversible, and that's indeed for the business climate. That's very, very important that the judicial system works well. When it comes to and I think that's also something maybe to be a bit clearer on this. We agreed with all the donors between each other that basically in this platform we will only speak about who does what, when, where, and maybe with which money, but the money flows there outside the platform. So each donor has their own channels and their own rules. So the Americans will use their financial rules, and we will use our financial regulation and our comitology and our procedures. And of course, we have our own specialized institution to prevent fraud, which is OLAF for the EU funding. But it's both ways. It means we have our institution to watch over that there is no fraud with our funding. But that's on the other hand, we are strengthening the institutions in Ukraine in themselves to work on anti-fraud, to work on anti-corruption. So it's basically we work on these 2 channels.
Thank you, Georg. I'm looking online now. There are a couple of questions, but I think they've already been answered. So I'm going to look in the room if there is any question from anyone. I see none. So maybe I'll there is one question. Please go ahead, please. There is a microphone coming, so the online participants can hear you as well. Go ahead.
I would like to come back to what Melinda said about the ownership of the reconstruction and recovery. So the question is rather strange. So actually, how to ensure this ownership versus the tools that have been chosen, I mean, grand plan creation. Because, okay, Lugano conference, we prepare something quickly, no time to consult, we go ahead, then Berlin conference, then Paris conference, then will be London conference, then hopefully the war will stop, and we need a grand plan, no time to consult. So how to balance ownership and the tool which was chosen, grand plan reconstruction? Thank you.
Thank you. Melinda, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I think there's an acknowledgement on the Ukrainian government that it's not going to be a grand plan, right? I think they've sort of moved away from that. When one of the ministers came through Washington recently, he had sort of staged out reconstruction in three different phases, the way that Tymofiy did. So I think they've sort of moved away from that. I think they're being more inclusive and listening, and I see growth. I mean, I think the guy who was in charge of meeting immediate humanitarian needs was doing a fantastic job. They brought in auditors like Tymofiy talked about, and I'd love to see more of that. So, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but making sure that local people have a say in the process and civil society has a say in the process is imperative.
Thank you, Melinda. I'm looking back to the room. Is there any other question? I don't see anyone, and I also don't see anyone online. So maybe I see that we have a couple of minutes left. So maybe I'll come back to you, Tom, because I'm curious to hear more. At some point, you mentioned about, of course, about Afghanistan, about Syria, and about what happens next when the conflict is more or less forgotten. And I want to ask you, in your opinion, if you just look ahead, what could be a best case scenario for demining Ukraine? Thank you.
Thanks, Mihai. I said during my remarks, I don't think there is a substitute for scale. So Ukraine could easily have several thousand Ukrainian deminers working day in, day out, fleets, tens, even hundreds of actually quite simple agricultural-based machines clearing the fields that they then go on to plow. It is a simple, repeatable exercise. It just needs scale and it needs funding commitment. So for my organization, a good case or a best case scenario would look like 1,200 staff at the end of this year, a doubling of where we are now, and an R&D center of excellence. And that would be something that could be multiplied out across other organizations and with the Ukrainian emergency service and MOD. I think the worst case scenario, I think we touched on that is simply becoming yesterday's news or something that gets forgotten about over the long periods of time. But Ukraine has everything in place now. It has the attention, it has the tools locally to do this work. So I think there's actually a very promising future for Ukraine in dealing head on with this problem of landmines and unexploded ordnance.
If I may just add a question using the opportunity, I was just a bit, let's say, I don't want to say demotivated, but when I saw the figure in the rapid damage and need assessment issued by the World Bank that $71 billion are only needed for demining, I was thinking by myself, you know, we would be happy to have 71 billion maybe for not overall reconstruction. We need more, but sometimes these figures are so, in a way, also demotivating and maybe even paralyzing. And that's what you are saying sounds much more, you know, you need steady funding, you need maybe you need some 100 millions per year, etc., but not 71 billion. Where does this come from? And is this, I find these huge figures, they have rather demotivating effects also on potential donors than this kind of putting it in bits and pieces and doing things step by steps. I think that's much more concrete and much more than in actually inviting donors also to jump on a train and to help. So maybe you could help a little bit understand this huge figure.
Thanks, Georg, and thanks for raising that, because it is often the numbers get amplified very, very easily. People wave a large hand over a small map, and then suddenly there are assumptions of very large contaminated areas where in truth, the actual bit that needs the expensive clearance is very small within that. So I think that often lies at the root of the problem, and it needs real expertise in the survey to get that right. But notwithstanding that, the message I would like to give is that it is a solvable problem. We're a couple of years away from fixing a problem in Sri Lanka that a decade ago people were saying would take several decades to clear, or it was just too big for people to comprehend. That's being done. The end is in sight in Cambodia. Again, that's a country that has had huge problems with landmines over a generation, but finally there is light at the end of the tunnel. Mozambique was completed as a test case. This can be done. We're not talking in the billions, or certainly not tens of billions. It is manageable. It is just about scale and persistence. So I would really want that message to donors to reach them, that it's a problem that can be solved. And the beauty of it, of course, is that it's finite. You do it once, and the benefit is there permanently. It's not something you need to go back to again and again. So thank you for raising that point, Georg.
Thank you, Tom. I think we're almost running out of time, but if I may, I'll just take a couple of more minutes from your time. Maybe I'll just go around to all of you, because we covered today in the discussion a lot of things, from demining, ownership, funding, immediate needs, role of the US, role of the EU. So maybe I would just ask you very shortly in a couple of sentences, 1 minute maximum each, to tell one thing that we should keep in mind as we move forward. And I'll go online to Tymofiy, and then we'll basically keep the same order. Tymofiy, if you're still with us and if you can hear us.
Yes, thank you so much. My main point, I guess, is not to forget about generation of markets, of private markets. So let's just to make it more specific or concrete, let's talk about the mining. We want to have agricultural companies interested in sustainable funding, continuation of the mining on top of donors. The same, if we're going to be doing recovery, rebuilding in an area, let's say we do affordable housing or something like that, we immediately have to move into models which will sustain it later as the donors' money runs out. So that's something we have not talked about it, but design of the markets so that there is a continuity and gradual transfer of the ownership in an economic fundamental sense away from donors and supporters to the communities. I think that is going to be critical. And we have not talked about it. I just want to add it to the discussion to keep thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Georg, you have the floor.
Yeah, no surprise that my main message is really to keep the reconstruction and the pre-accession together to make the perspective to join the Union really tangible. And that, of course, doesn't only depend on the European Commission. It depends a lot on the EU member states. Means we have the unanimity principle on this one. And I think the reconstruction will go better if this link is done. But that means the perspective cannot be like in the Western Balkans, that it takes ages and decades for Ukraine joining. If Ukraine does its job on their side, we have to do our job on our side, and we have to not pay lip service. I mean, the candidate status should not just be a symbolic encouragement last year because of the situation, but it should be a reality. We are committed on the side of the European Commission. We hope that all member states are equally committed in the sense of keeping on giving this concrete perspective and agreeing to the various steps, of course, responding to real reforms being done in Ukraine. But I think that will be extremely important to keep these things alive and keep the real perspective for accession to the EU for Ukraine.
Thank you. Now going to Melinda. Go ahead.
I'm going to steal Tom's point. So it's eminently doable. We need to have that attitude that we need to not overwhelm ourselves in the complexity of the task. It is complex, but let's focus on immediate needs and let's put Ukraine and Ukrainians first. And let's not reinvent the wheel and make it hopelessly complex. So when there's an opportunity to work with Ukrainian organizations that are competent, capable, honest, trustworthy, let's go Ukrainian first.
Thank you. Tom, go ahead.
I'm in the broken record category here. I would be very keen to hear more actually about how other end users such as the agricultural community might be able to contribute towards demining. We tend to think in our own little bubbles and our own boxes, but there will be others out there. And if there's a place that's going to innovate around funding and a long-term view of demining, it's going to be in Ukraine. But my closing remarks would just be a repeat of scale, of innovation and persistence to what is actually an achievable problem to solve. Thank you.
Correct. Thank you. we have to end. But before that, I just want to extend a big thank you to all of you. I think you raised some points, but I'm sure we're going to continue to discuss further. Now, my last task of the evening is just to introduce the next speaker, who is who actually is going to be a recorded message from Ambassador Ricardo López-Aranda, the Spanish ambassador. And he sent us a message, and my colleagues are going to put it on the screen. A very short message, and then I'll give the floor to Amanda for the last words.
Good afternoon. My name is Ricardo López-Aranda. I am Ambassador of Spain to Ukraine. I'm honored to be giving these concluding remarks in the conference on Russia's invasion to Ukraine, organized by the European Policy Center and the US mission to the European Union. I want to structure my intervention around three concepts: uncertainty, I wanted to give this intervention live, but good afternoon. My name is Ricardo López-Aranda. I am Ambassador of Spain to Ukraine. I'm honored to be giving these concluding remarks in the conference on Russia's invasion to Ukraine, organized by the European Policy Center and
Sorry about that. It seems there are some technical difficulties with the message of the ambassador. So maybe Amanda, this microphone works, so it should be fine. So please go ahead.
Works. I've had a bad experience with all microphones today. All right, I don't want to say very much because I know we've all been sitting here all afternoon, but on behalf of the EPC and the US mission to the EU, I really want to thank everybody for coming here today. A big thank you to all of the speakers who have joined us today, sharing their insights and evaluations on where we stand almost 1 year since Russia began its full-scale war in Ukraine, and for their valuable recommendations. I also want to thank the audience in the room and online for the questions that they have given. I think we can, conclude that the West has done a lot, but much more must and can be done. Putin is counting on Western unity crumbling. That cannot be allowed to happen. Russia's revanchist imperialism must be stopped. And the last thing I want to say is, as we hear, I would like you all to give a thought to the brave Ukrainian warriors that were night in dark. Yeah, I think it's frozen. I would welcome you all for a reception in the room where we have drinks and some snacks. I'm sure we'll have the ambassador another time. Thank you.